Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Damascus Radio, and it's time for our news for tonight. We're joined by Khalid Saqbani and Basim Bagdash. Minister of Religious Endowments, Dr. Muhammad Abdel Sattar Sayyid, has said Syria will triumph over those who assault it due to the cohesion between the army and the people who share the same objective. In a special interview with the Syrian Arab TV, the minister said the fatwa recently issued by the Higher Ifta Council in Syria represents the Islamic law's ruling concerning current events in Syria. Dr. Sayyid said the fatwa came to respond to previous enticing fatwas issued by Yusuf al-Qaradawi and a number of sheikhs who chose to follow the Zionist Turkish Saudi course. Dr. Sayyid said the Syrian people will join ranks with the Syrian Arab army in their battle in defense of the homeland in the face of terrorism. In new evidence to Britain's involvement in supporting terrorism and its overwhelming desire to increase arms supply offered to the terrorist groups in Syria, British Foreign Secretary William Hague said his country would further increase such support to bring about what he called change in Syria. Prior to the ministerial meeting between Russia and Britain, which was held in London today, Hague said the British government needed to exert more efforts to stop the loss of lives in Syria through enhancing support for the opposition and consequently pressuring the Syrian government to speed up the crucial political decisions that it should take. Hague said that in order to solve the problem diplomatically, it takes more time than necessary. He added that his country was doing its best with its allies to get the United Nations Security Council support for what he called the transitional process in Syria. He said, what we are facing is not a choice between diplomatic means on the one hand and practical assistance on the other, and that supporting the opposition is decisive to bring about change, and efforts must be exerted to realize both objectives. British Prime Minister David Cameron had yesterday declared that Britain might breach the European Union weapons embargo imposed on Syria by providing weapons to terrorist groups. Khalid?
Thank you, Basim. Our army units have killed and wounded several terrorists, and they destroyed their vehicles and confiscated their weapons after chasing them in a number of neighborhoods in Daraya. An official source said that the leader of an armed terrorist group called the Fath Battalion and several snipers were killed south of Al-Sayyid Sakini monument. The source also added that the weapons confiscated including anti-armor shells, rifles, machine guns, and communication equipment. 7 cars were destroyed and the terrorists inside were killed west of the city. Moreover, an army unit also foiled an attempt by 2 of the terrorists who were trying to blow up 8 explosive charges, and they have been planted in Al Ali district and the Society's neighborhood of the city. In Deir ez-Zor, an army unit has eliminated a number of terrorists and they wounded others of several nationalities. The terrorists were attacking the citizens and vandalizing the properties in Al-Jbeli and Al-Rashidiyya neighborhood. Among these terrorists were some known terrorists who are leaders of groups. In Homs, the army units have foiled an attempt by armed terrorist groups to infiltrate into Lebanon to Syria through many locations in the Tel Kalach countryside of Homs. The terrorists opened fire from the Lebanese sides towards the border guards on the Syrian side. The army also responded, inflicting heavy losses upon the terrorists, killing a number of them, while the rest of them fled back towards Lebanon. And a new evidence about the flow of the Salafi terrorists into Syria with the complicity of the Erdogan government, a French journalist named George Malborno, a specialist in the Middle Eastern affairs, said in a report published today in Le Figaro newspaper that dozens of French extremists, with the help of the Turkish authorities, have arrived into Syria, and they are joining the terrorist groups there. On his part, the French Interior Minister said that the number of terrorists who actually managed to enter into Syria are estimated at 50 to 80 French nationalists. The international Save the Children organization concerned with the defense of children's rights has issued a new report about the constantly increasing number of children who are being recruited by the armed terrorist groups in Syria. The BBC quoted the Britain-based organization as saying in its report entitled Childhoods Caught in Crossfires that some of the children were forced to engage in military activities, and those who are under 18 sometimes were used as human shields by the armed terrorist groups. The report also criticized the measure as a flagrant violation of the children's rights, which contravenes the international laws. The report added that a monitoring group has registered the killing of 17 children linked to the armed terrorist groups since the beginning of the crisis in Syria, and that a large number of others are seriously wounded. Some of them are undergoing permanent physical disability. The United Nations official also had declared that last June that the armed opposition is accused of using children as fighters in a step that violates the international agreements which forbids the children's recruitment. Back to you, Basim.
Thank you, Khalid. American Secretary of State John Kerry said the USA was working to get the Syrian leadership and an opposition that is ready to cooperate to sit at the table of negotiations with a view to forming a transitional government within the frame of the Geneva Statement. During a press conference with his Norwegian counterpart, Espen Park, Kerry said the Geneva Statement requires mutual approval by both sides in order to form a transitional government. He added that his country would continue to pressure the parties to the Syrian opposition to ensure the unification of their ranks. On his part, the Norwegian foreign minister said his country's stand is completely identical with that of the USA. A person was killed and 16 others were injured in Ain al-Hilwa camp clashes south of Lebanon, which started yesterday and lasted until this morning. Al-Manar, Lebanese TV channel, said that the follow-up committee of the Palestinian National Forces in the camp was able to control the situation. On his part, the leader in the Al-Fatah movement, Munir al-Maqdah, announced the end of the clashes in Ain al-Hilwa, clarifying that the Palestinian follow-up committees is permanently in session to find out the reasons behind these clashes. Al-Maqdah asserted that the situation in Ain al-Hilwa will not escalate and that it is not allowed for any side to take the camp to the abyss, adding that all the Palestinian powers agree on keeping the camp and the neighboring areas secure. It is to be noted that the residents of the camp had earlier demonstrated against the return of violence, demanding the neutralization of the camp from the local and regional tensions, as tens of the camp's families were displaced due to these clashes. Back to you, Khalid.
Thank you, Basim. One Palestinian was killed and others were wounded by the Israeli occupation troops in the Fawar refugee camp, which is in the West Bank. A Palestinian medical source confirmed that a Palestinian citizen named Muhammad al-Atta, a former prisoner aged 24, died of wounds he sustained during the Israeli attack. A number of the citizens were also taken to hospital after sustaining several injuries. In the Gaza Strip, the occupation bulldozers broke into the Farahin neighborhood east of the city of Khan Yunis, and they began dredging the Palestinian farms and their lands and demolishing the Palestinians' properties. The workers of the Suez Canal Company for Containers have continued their strike for the second consecutive day, demanding the incentives for repairing the big ship of Eni Mersik, which is docked at Borsaide's port. The seventh-day newspaper has quoted the source in the port as saying that because of these events, the company will lose its clients in the long run, adding that the workers have no rights to claim because of what has happened and what is in the core of this is in the core of their duty, and they do not have any reasons to stop working at the port. On the other hand, the Lira Brothers movement has called for surrounding the guidance office of the Muslim Brotherhood in Al-Muqattam next Friday. Back to you, Basim.
Thank you, Khalid. In continuation of their repressive practices and arbitrary measures, Khalifa Security or Khalifiyya, the Khalifiyya security forces in Bahrain have arrested 6 citizens on charges of abusive tweets against the king, sending them to jail for interrogation, and that they will be sent to court later on. The worker at Bahrain Center for Human Rights, Naji Fatil, pointed out that instead of celebrating the International Anti-Electronic Censor Day, the Bahraini authorities have illegally detained 6 people, all from the opposition, without a warrant, asserting that this detention will contribute to the decline of freedom level in Bahrain. It is to be noted that for more than 2 years now, Bahrain is witnessing an escalating popular protests against Al-Khalifa regime, demanding full political, social and economical reforms in the country, which were faced by suppression and arbitrary procedures. And now over to the final item with my colleague Khalid.
Thank you, Basim. Democratic Korea announced today that it has cancelled the truce treaty, which has ended the Korean War of 1953 in response to the war threats by the United States and South Korea, warning that the next step will be unprecedented military responses. An armed forces military spokesman in the Democratic Korea said that in a statement that everyone should know that the truce treaty is not valid anymore, and that Democratic Korea is no longer committed to the declaring of the non-aggression between the North and the South. It is to be noted that Pyongyang had earlier announced last week that it would cancel their truce treaty and that the peace agreement signed with Seoul in protest against the United States and the Southern Korean maneuvers, which started last Monday. Democratic Korea has furthermore threatened to launch nuclear assaults against the U.S. and South Korea in response to the new sanctions imposed by the United Nations Security Council after Pyongyang has cancelled its 3rd nuclear experiment.
With that last item, ladies and gentlemen, we conclude our news for tonight. Thank you very much for joining us. Damascus Radio presents News and Views.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. The Ministerial Committee assigned with following up the procedures of implementing the political program to solve the crisis in Syria continues its meetings and consultations with all the political powers of society and all components of the Syrian people, with the aim of reaching a mutual political vision for modern Syria. The vast national dialogue, chosen by the political leadership, represented by President Bashar al-Assad, is the only safe way for getting out of the crisis. There is no doubt that good and important results will be reached at the end of this national dialogue with the participation of other national opposition powers, which are in contact to give the political process a vast variety and momentum. Those who are concerned about Syria and seek political solutions have so far realized that there is no way out of the sinister conspiracy and bloodshed except through the Syrians themselves, sitting at the table of negotiations and proposing the ideas that will not only lead to a way out of the crisis and end the violence, but would also have a mutual vision for modern Syria as well. Enhancing the culture of the national dialogue with its correct principles is an important issue because it contributes to finding a national trend that pushes towards the political solution. Here comes the role of enhancing the national opposition as a necessity to take part in exposing the powers which claim that they represent the Syrian people. Those powers are in fact no more than a cheap tool of the foreign enemy whose interests and agendas only pour in the interest of the Zionist entity and its tools in the region. There is no doubt that we are now heading towards a comprehensive national dialogue which will be the base for a comprehensive political solution because it will include all the components and powers of the Syrian society that will contribute in drawing a new political map for Syria in the future, an issue which forms the essence of the political program launched by President Bashar al-Assad in his significant speech on the 6th of last January.
That was news and views from Damascus Radio. Damascus Radio presents Syrian Local Press Review.
Damascus newspapers today highlighted the following major front-page headlines. Russia says the USA is interpreting the Geneva Statement unilaterally to support the opposition. The Czech Republic calls on the EU to support dialogue in Syria and rejects foreign intervention in Syrian affairs. Our armed forces continue their operations against terrorists and destroy 7 machine guns-equipped vehicles and a bulldozer in Damascus, Homs and Aleppo suburbs. The Foreign Ministry says Arab, Western and regional states insist on supporting terrorists. The Foreign Ministry says sources supporting terrorism must stop such support in order for dialogue to succeed and the violence to end. The Foreign Ministry affirms that Syria looks forward to an effective role by the Security Council so that the international community could maintain its credibility in combating terrorism. The National Progressive Front offers condolences on the death of President Chavez. The Council of Ministers endorses a fair draft law on expropriation and ratifies the purchase of 10 Antonov-aircraft in favor of the Syrian aviation establishment. A media source says joining military service is a sacred national duty, and reports about a state of public alert are groundless. Perez calls for Arab troops interference in Syria. An American document says the regimes in Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt are in danger. Hezbollah says Syria is waging a battle of existence, not a battle of authority. The editorial in Tishrin refers to those sides of the Syrian opposition who call for foreign military intervention in Syria, whether through NATO or Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. The paper expresses belief that those who call for repeating the Libyan or Iraqi scenarios cannot be really Syrians or uphold a national project that finds its positive echo among the Syrian people. There is no single Syrian national, the editorial says, who may accept the so-called change of the regime be brought about through NATO tanks or UN interventions. Dialogue can be held, the paper goes on, with those armed groups who show readiness to abandon their arms, whereas it would be quite impossible even to think of inviting to dialogue who depend on foreign sites and call for foreign military intervention. No Syrian may accept to hold dialogue with this kind of opposition, the editorial in Tishrin asserts.
That was a review of the Syrian local press issued in Damascus this morning.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Palestinians resisted the Nakba in 1880s when European Jews colonists kicked them off land they purchased from absentee landlords and denied them labor on land they had tilled for centuries. Palestinian resistance took the form of a major three-year revolt in the 1930s against British support for Zionists in bringing about the Nakba. Palestinians also resisted after the actions of 1947-1948, when most of their land was conquered and confiscated by the racist laws of the Jewish state. The ongoing resistance to the Nakba in the West Bank and in Gaza, we are still told by Israel and the New York Times, is in fact what invites more Nakbas. If Palestinians would allow Israel to lay siege to them in the largest open-air prison in the world, called Gaza, without resisting it, Israel would not be forced to bomb them and kill their children and destroy their homes. It would only serve them and keep them inside the apartheid war. If Palestinians would simply accept the status as concubine, the Nakba as an unfinished process would be finally completed. This logic of concept is not exceptional at all, nor is it limited to the Israelis. Has not the resistance in Iraq more recently stood in the way of the final completion of the mission of the American invasion, which President Bush declared accomplished 5 years ago? It is the Iraqi resistance to the destruction that the Americans visit Iraq on that forces that pursuit or process of American destruction to continue and the American mission to remain unaccomplished. But what is that the Palestinians continue to resist in the Nakba that Israel continues to impose upon them? Moshe Dayan once described the Nakba as follows. Quote, Jewish villages were built in the place of Arab villages. You don't even know the names of these Arab villages, and I don't blame you, because these geography books no longer exist. End quote. Not only do the books not exist, the Arab villages are not there either. Nahlal arose in the palace of Mahlu, Gavelt in the place of Jepta, Syria in place of Haifa, and Kafar Yashum in the place of Tel Shuman. There is now not only a single place built in the country that did not have a former Arab population. The success of the Palestinian resistance in the Nakba has forced a similar process of remaining the so-called Israeli or Zionist and Israeli victories that is now adopted across much of the world and even in a more limited fashion in the United States. To echo Dayan, Palestinian resistance and victimizations replace Zionist conquest and victories. Many of you don't even know the names of these Israeli victories, and I don't blame you, because these Zionist history books and propaganda that once legitimized them are no longer considered legitimate. Not only have these books and this propaganda lost legitimacy, but the Zionist and Israeli victories are no longer recognized as such either. The Nakba arose in the place of the so-called Israel's War of Independence. Apartheid replaced the so-called Jewish sovereignty. The expulsion of the Palestinians replaced what is called return to the Jews to their ancestral homeland. The Palestinians are determined to resist all forms of occupation posed by the racist Israeli practices with the aim of wiping out the genuine Arab identity of Palestine and changing its demographic and demographical status. Nakba would continue until the return of all usurped rights of the Palestinians and the establishment of an independent state with Jerusalem as its capital.
You're listening to Damascus Radio, the broadcasting service of the Syrian Arab Republic. Before we sign off with the national anthem, here is a final look at the news summary. Minister of Religious Endowments Dr. Abdel Sattar Sayed says Syria will triumph over those who assault it. British Foreign Secretary William Hague says his country would further increase such support to bring about what he called change in Syria. The international Save the Children organization issues a new report about the constantly increasing number of children who are being recruited by the armed terrorist groups in Syria. American Secretary of State John Kerry says the USA was working to get the Syrian leadership and opposition to sit at the table of negotiations. A person is killed and 16 others are injured in Ain al-Hilwa camp clashes south of Lebanon, which started yesterday and lasted till this morning. And one Palestinian is killed and others are wounded by the Israeli occupation troops in Al-Fawar refugee camp in the West Bank. With that, ladies and gentlemen, we come to the end of our transmission for tonight. Until we meet again tomorrow at the same time and on the same frequencies, we wish you all the best from Damascus Radio, the broadcasting service of the Syrian